Hi, this is Miss Hardy. I'm spending my winter break in Alaska near Delta Junction, our 49th state, and so I thought I would take the time to make some videos on the history of Alaska, something that doesn't often get touched on in any great detail in most survey courses, but I wanted to give you a taste of Alaska and its beauty and its harshness. As I'm filming right now, it is 15 degrees below zero. That's actually up 20 degrees from yesterday when it was 37 degrees below zero. So it's cold, but it's beautiful. As you can see, we've had about 6 inches of snow in the past few days and everything is lovely. It's about 1:30 in the afternoon and the sun is getting ready to set here near the winter solstice. So today, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the purchase of Alaska and how Alaska came to be part of the United States. So Alaska obviously was inhabited long before any Europeans ever knew about it or thought about it by dozens and hundreds of different native tribes who made a living hunting, trapping, gathering, and generally trying to survive the harshness that is the Alaskan climate. But the first European contacts with Alaska were by Russians, more specifically by fur traders coming out of Siberia. And the first large-scale Russian expedition to Alaska was led by the Danish explorer Vitus Bering, who was sent on an exploration mission by the Russian emperor. And he and his men traveled from Siberia by ship to the Aleutian Islands and the different islands in that area. And there they found a huge population of an incredibly valuable to them animal, that is the sea otter. Now, sea otters have the thickest fur of any mammal on Earth. And so their fur was incredibly valuable and incredibly favored by Europeans for its warmth and softness. So when they found this massive population of sea otters, they immediately began to hunt them. And when they sent those pelts back to Russia and the Russian market, they were incredibly valuable. That led to hundreds of other Russian traders making their way to Alaska after 1732 and beginning a market in sea otter pelts. Now, the Russians, however, even as they began to settle in Alaska, they never went very far inland. Their presence was almost entirely confined to the coasts, where they would settle in small trading villages where they would then employ native Alaskans to hunt for them and bring them furs. And I say employ. It was not always the choice of the natives. The Russians often would employ force or threats, holding family members hostage to force native Alaskans to hunt sea otters and seals for them and bring them the furs, which they would then send back to Russia but in shiploads. The hunting was so intense and sea otters were so easy to hunt that by the early 1800s, a population of well over 1 million sea otters had been reduced to only a few thousand clinging on in very isolated areas. The sea otter population around Alaska became almost extinct, the brink of extinction, and has only come back in the last few decades from that perilous position. So as the population of sea otters lessened and it became less lucrative, the population of Russians in Alaska lessened, although there were a few permanent settlements and there was intense missionary activity on the part of Russian Orthodox priests to attempt to convert the native populations. But for over 150 years of Russian settlement in Alaska, there were only a few thousand Russians living in Alaska by the 1850s in villages along the coast. And in the 1850s is when a for sale sign essentially was put up on Alaska. Russia went through a terrible war known as the Crimean War from 1853 to 1856. Without going into a lot of detail on the Crimean War, it was fought on the Crimean Peninsula in the Black Sea between Russia, the Ottoman Empire, France, and most especially Great Britain. Russia was fighting the combined forces of the Ottoman Empire, Great Britain, and France. And Russia was on the losing end of that war. So after Russia lost the Crimean War to Great Britain, they were very concerned that given Alaska's proximity to Canada, Great Britain would also try to go ahead and take Alaska from them in the near future. And rather than and they knew there was no way they could defend the territory given how far away it was. So rather than lose it, they decided to go ahead and try to sell it, get something out of it while they could. They approached the Great Britain with the possibility of buying it, but also they approached the United States. Now, in the late 1850s, as I'm sure you will remember from last semester from U.S. History 1, the United States was not in a really good position to be thinking about acquiring more territory. They were trying to deal with how to deal with the territory they already had. So in the late 1850s, that approach was not successful to the United States. But in 1867, after the Civil War was over, Russia tried again, negotiating with Secretary of State William Seward on the possibility of the United States purchasing Alaska from Russia. So in 1867, those negotiations were concluded, and Secretary of State William Seward was able to negotiate a successful treaty for the purchase of Alaska from Russia. That treaty offered the purchase price of $7.2 million for the entire territory of Alaska, over 586,000 square miles of territory. And William Seward negotiated the treaty. President Andrew Johnson signed it, and then on May 28, 1867, that treaty was ratified by the United States Senate, leading to the purchase of Alaska from Russia. Now, it was not actually transferred to the United States until October 18th, 1867 was the formal transfer of sovereignty, a ceremony taking place in what is now Sitka, Alaska, on the southeast coast, where Russian troops took down the Russian flag and American troops raised the American flag over the governor's residence there in Sitka. And although it has become known as Seward's Folly or Seward's Icebox, and the modern perception is that the purchase of Alaska was very unpopular with the public initially, being seen as a very foolish purchase. Why on earth would you want to purchase such a frozen wasteland? And as I stand here with my toes getting colder and colder, I might concur just a little bit with the frozen part, but the beauty and the valuable resources of Alaska were clear to Americans even from the start. It was actually quite popular in public opinion, except among the direct political opponents of President Andrew Johnson. So there was some pushback at the time, and it was called Seward's Icebox in some opposition newspapers, but for the most part, it was very popular. And in fact, thousands of Americans flocked to Alaska immediately following the U.S. acquisition of it. They wanted to make their fortune in Alaska. And so thousands came to Alaska hoping for opportunity, and there were opportunities to be had. However, Alaska's a long, long way from the rest of the United States. It's a long way to civilization. It's difficult to transport things to and from, even to this day, and especially in the late 1800s, it was very difficult. So the thousands who came, many of them turned back around and left almost immediately, saying, it's too cold, it's too far away, and I can get the same opportunities elsewhere. So there was only a very small population of Americans, only a few hundred Americans.
So, if you're thinking that video stopped a little abruptly, you would be right. It stopped because, apparently, an iPhone doesn't particularly like recording video in 15 degrees below zero weather. So I was almost finished with the information I wanted to convey in this lecture. I was just going to say that the population of Americans in Alaska remained at a level of only about a few hundred, mostly in the southeastern portion of the territory on what is now known as the Inside Passage along the coast of southeast Alaska until about 1896, and that is when gold would be discovered in the neighboring Yukon Territory along the Klondike River, and the beginnings of what would become known as the Klondike Gold Rush brought hundreds and thousands of Americans and people from all over the world to Alaska, and brought Alaska much more firmly into the American consciousness and made it more a part of the United States.